Hello, my name is Paula Scher. I'm a graphic designer and a principal of Pentagram Design in New York City, and I'm here at the Adobe conference where I'm giving a lecture on living, breathing identities. I hope everybody who came enjoyed it. Good morning. Thank you for getting up. I wouldn't. I'm going to talk today about identity design in a really open way, and it's really sort of my own thoughts about it, and at the end of this there'll be some Q&A, so I'd love some participation, and you can challenge me or ask me anything you like, and without further ado, I'm going to start. So, a logo is a thing that everybody is highly interested in and seems like there's enormous value in it, and it is seemingly the most important part of design accomplished by a corporation in relationship to what they do. And the word logo comes from Greek. It was actually developed by Aristotle. He used it to describe making an argument for something. And what it essentially means is how things are understood, meaning how they're understood by other people. And the literal translation of logo is word, which is what a logo is. So if you say the word apple, you may see the drawing of the apple. I find it fascinating right now that for the past maybe 5 or 6 years, there's been so much press about logos when they're introduced to the public and so much criticism of their form. But actually, you would never look at a logo the same way after 10 years. And if the logo's good like Coca-Cola, it can last nearly 100. So what are we really talking about? I know when I ask clients what they think the best logo designs are, they invariably say Nike or Apple. And that's because they've seen them for a very long time, and they're already conditioned to think the forms look cool. For example, if you look at Nike, you see that actually it was sort of dorky in the beginning. The weights are weird, the script is dumb. It got a little more sophisticated, then it got boxed, and then suddenly some bright person realized it was better without the type. But this is a 20-year period you're looking at. This is something that evolves over a very slow period of time, and it's coupled with advertising and promotion, and that you come to understand it to mean something because it doesn't exist purely as a form by itself. If that was introduced blindly by a company and you'd never seen it before, you might not even think it's particularly attractive or that it meant motion, though everybody assumes it is because they've seen it in animation and they've seen it in connection to sport. Look at Apple's first logo. Isn't that amazing? Now, I'm a lot older than most of you, and I remember Apple Records, which was the Beatles label, and I thought that this was sort of a bad rip, and the Apple logo, which was a photograph, was much better than the silly rainbow that I look at now. It looks sort of like something left over from a Disney animation. And you notice it changes all the time. They change it really every year. The form is recognizable, and the form is related to the product, and that it's inescapable that you would ever even begin to separate it. You're always connected to Apple in the way you understand that company. Now, in the late 90s, I started doing a lot of large-scale identities and medium-sized identities. And I did things based on the idea that the form had to become recognizable and that things had to represent the company in some way. For example, I designed the Citibank logo in 1998 when it was a merger of the Travelers Insurance Company and Citicorp. And Citicorp at that time was just blue, and they had a logo that was a little bit of they called a compass rose. It looked like a little compass, and some italic typography. And Travelers had an umbrella. So we said, okay, a perfect merger is we have a metaphorical umbrella over the word city, and city is blue. And after about a year and a half of trying to push this idea through, which was, I think, as many of you know, really the first sketch I made in the first meeting, we got this thing through the company, but not really totally. It ran in an ad because Fallon had to release an ad to the public, and it was the last logo on the table, and we stuck it on the ad. And that's actually the birth of the Citibank logo, which is now in existence for over 20 years. The logo is recognizable not because of the arc, not because of the typeface, but because of the ubiquitousness of the banks. You see them everywhere. You see the cash machines everywhere, you see the bank everywhere, and you see a lot of advertising for it. That's how big companies get known. I can't say that they were as clever as Nike in terms of becoming recognizable, because Nike really made much better advertising. But when you look at these things together, the way you feel about the mark is the way you feel about the company. The High Line, which I designed in 1999 and is now 20 years old, was sort of an obvious logo, and it lives in New York City, and if you go to the High Line, you see it. Otherwise, you don't see it all. There's some promotional materials for it, but really not very much. But New York City, it's highly recognizable, and I doubt they would actively change it, though they attach it to things sometimes in eccentric ways. And in the 90s and the early 2000s, I mostly designed marks that had this kind of approach. Jazz at Lincoln Center was also designed in about, I think, 2000, close to the High Line. And this is the first logo design I did for it, and then realized 12 years later that it looked very dated. And it was interesting to me how you could design something and just small things about the letter forms would make it dated. The worst thing about it was its stupid name. I mean, Jazz at Lincoln Center sounds, it's not really like good jazz, it sounds like it's jazz for old people. So Wynton Marsalis didn't like that much either, and ultimately we got rid of the at Lincoln Center. But this was the first logo iteration. I'll show you the second later. Criterion, which I designed somewhere, I don't know, 2004, 2005, was for an old film company. And if I showed you this mark like this, you wouldn't be able to at all know what this mark was for. And when I show it like that, then all of a sudden, if you watch these films, you begin to recognize it. These smaller kind of cultural companies and not-for-profit businesses have a tough time being recognized because they don't have the money to do the kind of advertising that a place like Nike or Apple does, and they don't have the building structures in urban places where you're going to see a lot of things that have their names on them. So they have to be much more clever about it. I worked with a ballet director in the middle of 2000, I think it was maybe 2008. It's hard for me to remember the years. And he never could stay with one logo, and he kept changing them every 3 years, so he had no recognizability at all. So I gave him three versions of the same logo in different configurations, figuring he could get through 9 years without changing his logo. I don't think, it actually has lasted a lot longer than that. It's still around. The interesting thing is he was fired and nobody bothered touching it, so I think that has more to do with the logo's survival than any form. This was a logo that was designed by virtue of its name. What happened was that the Met, which was the Metropolitan Opera in New York, used to be the Met, but then the Metropolitan Museum of Art became the Met because it had a better shopping bag. This is true. It's not the mark, it was the scale of type on the shopping bag. And the Metropolitan Opera, the only place you saw the words the Met were on fundraising items, and not everybody saw them. So I convinced the company to change their name to the Met Opera, and the logo really was better in this configuration. Now, they use this still, and it has been, I guess, fairly successful when you go to the opera, because in the gift shop, it looks terrific because all the products are done very elegantly, and they seem to subcontract the work to a very good firm who does the gift store piece. But the advertising is terrible. And they try to make it mass market when it isn't, and it looks like bad Broadway or advertising. And I find it frankly embarrassing. As a matter of fact, I have a hard time when identities I've designed, I lose complete control of, and they go to different places where you don't really have the same aesthetics and you don't have the same viewpoints about what the design should be. When it works, it's spectacular, and I'll show you some examples of that. But I think that's happened with more than half of my logos, where I actually disagree with the way they're executed. I'm amazed they survive at all. In 2012, I started to realize that this sort of approach to identity design was not working for me. And the reason it wasn't working for me is most of the companies I worked for were not on the scale of Citi. They were much smaller. They tended often to be not-for-profits and cultural institutions. And that if I couldn't control the way something looked with an in-house art department by being able to hire them myself and train them, very often the identities really fell apart. And I started to think about how you could make identity as a form much more interesting, and much more interesting for somebody else to work with. And I realized that it is the repetitive, boring nature of logos stuck in a corner against a standards manual that tells you what size it's got to be that is really a brain number, and that makes a design life very depressing for somebody in that situation. So I did something I always do when I'm trying to figure out how to solve a problem, and that is that I use a pro bono project to help me figure out how something might work if I change the rules a bit. And in 2012, I got asked to design the Type Directors Club exhibit and book and all the promotions for it, which is something that goes on for about six months if you ever get it. And I thought, well, this is great because there are lots of promotions that have to connect, and they need a cover for the book, and let me see what I can figure out about what is recognizable. Now, I think still about identity is something that you come to recognize. So here's what I learned. I did this TDC for the Type Directors Club that was sort of these concentric lines, and then I gave them to 12 different people who were working at Pentagram, and I told them to redraw it, and found that you would not recognize it as the same thing as if it had curves or if the color changed, but in fact you could do many versions of different concentric lines together, and if you saw these things one after another in rapid succession, you would recognize it as the same thing. So it began to become a way I thought of working. Now, this is the Type Directors Club. This isn't a major corporation, therefore it's much more radical and more impossible to sell anywhere else. I admit that. But the fact of the matter is, the premise works, that you can make something feel like the same thing and vary it significantly. So here it is used on the cover, and by the way, that's not the same TDC as the first one I showed you. They vary in each instance. So then I went to readdress jazz at Lincoln Center. And I found that there were some nuances that really had to be changed with the logo. That what was wrong with it, aside from the at Lincoln Center part, is that for some reason, this font, which happened to be Eagle Light, looked too pointy and sort of too unbalanced with the A, and it needed to be heavied up. And I don't know why time frames do that, but it does. And the slight tweak made it more palatable without the A. And you can sort of see it in the form, that the balance of the A against the other letter forms is just a little less awkward than this. And this is the sort of boring nuance that we do all day long that our clients don't understand that you have to do to get something done. What's significant about jazz and what's recognizable is the A. And that was designed in the first instance when I met Wynton Marsalis, because I asked him what jazz was, and he said, jazz is syncopation. And I said, what does syncopation mean? And he says it means when you got a bunch of things in an order and one thing's off. And he didn't realize at that moment in time he told me how to design his logo. But I look for things like that all the time. It's what makes work terrific. So if it works for a logo, it could really work for the whole alphabet. So we redrew the alphabet. It was a bit heavied up, and we created a situation where all the O's and all the rounds became the heavy font. And you can see it in this form, and it looks like there's a lot of it, doesn't it? It looks like there's just a lot of those O's. But the fact of the matter is, in the alphabet, there really aren't many. It isn't anywhere like what you think it looks like over here, because in this instance, you realize that the rounds are used more than the straight lines in typography. It's very fascinating. I had no idea, but I found that there were a lot of them in virtually every time we set somebody's name or any time we set some language up. Take a look at that. They sort of look like much more than 1 out of 24 in the instance. And in typography, but what was great is that you could just recognize it immediately. You could recognize this without a logo. And what was important is that these guys don't have a lot of money. They can't promote. They can't do this thing over and over again. So this thing, when it exists on bus shelters and on their announcements and at the theater, it suddenly gives them an ability to be recognized, and something that you can't buy if you have a non-entity logo and system. So here you start using it. We started developing experimentally how you could play with this thing, how you would use it in design. And here the in-house art department starts actually commissioning photography and working with it. And it was very strong. You could see it right away on its first campaign, a series of campaigns. And the word Brubeck already means jazz the minute you see his name in that kind of typography. This was a major subway campaign they ran. And they still use it. This sort of work is dependent very much on whether or not the in-house art department is up to snuff. And for 2 major periods, they had a spectacular in-house art department. And now less so. It goes up and down. And I find it, because I'm no longer involved unless they bring me back, there's really not much I can do about it. But I find that even when I see the pieces, they're still recognizable as jazz. The Philadelphia Museum of Art in Philadelphia. Has anybody here ever been to Philadelphia? From Philadelphia? Yay, okay, somebody. So this place is a behemoth. It looks like a giant old kind of institution. It could be a courthouse, it could be a science place, it could be a museum. You don't know what it is. This is what it looks like. It sits up on a hill in Philadelphia, and it looks sort of terrifying, but it became famous in the 70s simply because Rocky Balboa ran up and down the steps and jumped up and down. So people come to Philadelphia to go to this museum, to run up and down the steps, jump up and down, and then they leave. They never go in. How depressing is that? Worse yet, the mayor, Rocky Balboa, Sylvester Stallone, presented a Rocky Balboa statue in gold to the Philadelphia Museum, and the mayor presented it to the museum, and the museum was so embarrassed, and they had to hide it behind a tree. And every now and then somebody comes and checks to make sure it's still there. For the past 8 years, Frank Gehry's been working on a major renovation of the museum. It's really terrific. He tunneled through the base of the building and opened up some light through the steps. He's put in sort of glass into the staircase. It's quite amazing what's going on. And when you're downstairs, it's really beautiful. You can walk through the whole museum. And about the point he started working on the project, they hired me to readdress the identity of the place. They have a lot of problems with identity. The first thing is they don't call themselves by their name. If you get to Philadelphia and you say, take me to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and you say that to a cab driver, he says, what? And you say, Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he says, what? And you say, Philadelphia Museum of Art. And he says, oh, the Art Museum. And then you say, yes, and look at the signs. That's what the signs in Philadelphia say. So that there's no reason to even know what the place is called. They had a logo that looked like this. There's nothing wrong with the logo. It looks very institutional. It looks like it could be a college. It looks like it's an institute of art. It looks very, very serious. It doesn't look like it's much fun, especially in a building that sits like that on the top of the hill. And you don't know what kind of art it has. It looks from this logo that it probably has art that's fairly historic and not necessarily contemporary. And the Philadelphia Museum of Art has one of the best contemporary collections on the East Coast. It's really staggering. Drexel University is right next to it, and they have banners, and they've got another animal. Sort of doesn't look too different from that animal unless you're into, sort of these kinds of, fantasy animals. But this was a problem for them. We proposed that they emphasize art because the fact of the matter is nobody calls it the Philadelphia Museum of Art. They call it the Art Museum. And that this gave them permission to at least understand what they were talking about. It's art, and it's art with a capital A. So what we did is give them 1 million A's, and that the A's would represent every form of art that they have in the museum, and that they could continue to change and add to them. And this situation was happier for me because there's a gentleman named Louis Bravo that I hired who is the creative director, and he keeps this thing pretty tight, and it's really grown well, which is very, very exciting. And over the years, we've added many components to it. There are rules for it, and the rules are that with the A's, if you're showing a piece of art, you don't use the art that's an A, you use the straight art. And if you have things that don't have the art, like tickets and badges and other things that are given away in a museum, then you can use all the A's as you chose. The biggest problem is that there's always somebody who has to approve which A goes on which thing, and that's when everybody goes a little crazy and they can't make decisions and it becomes a little bit of a nightmare. Here are badges, children's programs. And when the Frank Gehry exhibit of what he was going to do to the museum opened, he drew a whole series of A's for this purpose, which was wonderful, and that we try to do all the time, to either get an artist whose work is showing to either donate something, make something, or you make it from it. And of course, this stuff becomes terrific merchandising and, what I call craphola. Crapola is the stuff that makes people remember who you are when they think they're getting something when it's really something they're going to throw away. We all make a lot of crapola. It's a good thing to do. You got to get good at it. The world needs it. My goal in crapola is when somebody's really saved it. I'm always mystified. But here you see all the ways we use the A's, and we made a lot of it. Wrapping. The store is big. These things were all, I think the projects I showed you were all between 2012 and about 2013. And it was really right after I did that Type Directors Club work where I was very keen on these movable components. But when I began working on Windows, I didn't actually expect to be doing something that was like that. And it showed me another way to think about the notion of finding components for the same thing. Windows was a much more difficult problem. They, I went the wrong way. How did I do that? Oh, I want to do it here, sorry. Pushed my computer by accident. Bill Gates founded Microsoft so that engineers would lead these various companies, and that the companies would be more like individual fiefdoms within Microsoft, and that the companies would be able to thrive because the engineers would be excited to be inventing new software all the time, and that the software would be more powerful and more innovative than other companies' software because of the structure. And he was right about that. But then along came Apple that had this monolithic structure where one person really made all decisions for the whole company. what you're looking at when you look at all these different companies from Microsoft is sort of companies not talking to each other at all when they make their identity, so that the individual sub-brands are all, terrific, but when you put them together, it doesn't really add up to anything. And it was a problem for the company, and they wanted to have me use Windows 8 to design what they called a principle-based identity system. Now, I never thought of it as principles driving the thing, but actually the Type Directors Club was exactly that. It was a principle about weight of lines that existed straight in one color that could change form. The thing was, because there would be all these different companies that had some individuality, what would be the thing that would drive making them look collective and similar at the same time, and also have their own unique personality? So I started with Windows, which was really the elephant in the room because it was the biggest company and made the most money. And I looked at the history of the Windows logos, which I found really interesting. Like, the first logo is not terribly different from where they are now, if you look at it. It was an eccentric window. The notion of Windows was always that it was, just by virtue of the name of it, it was a tool that gave you a look at something. Where Apple makes objects of desire, Microsoft makes these tools that enable you to do very specific things, and that you are the driver of the tool. Then you can almost hear what went on in the meeting in the next series. Somebody says, yeah, that's a nice eccentric window, but it isn't digitized. You need to show it's digitized. We're digital, so that they did all these bit marks. And then somebody else says, yeah, and it doesn't have any motion. It really should have motion. That thing looks static. So then and I've been in these meetings. They're like that. And you wind up with something like that when you have that kind of a conversation. They stuck it on a phone, and somebody was afraid you wouldn't know where to push the button. And then the final one looks sort of like four bent tiles that are waving in the breeze. I couldn't quite figure it out. They were introducing a piece of software that had these very flat, modernist backgrounds at the time that I was designing it, and I thought, well, that didn't relate to, sort of the curved and highlighted graphic there. So I said to them at the time of the meeting, and this is a true story, I said, your name is Windows, why are you a flag? I thought what they meant was this, that they really meant it was a window and perspective, but they were, confused by motion, highlights, amount of colors, all that sort of stuff. And when I looked at this, it dawned on me that perspective was really a good way to think about the whole company of Microsoft, because they are making tools that people operate from their own perspective. It seemed like a nice analogy, and it certainly would make a better window. So this, in fact, for drawing these things, is the standards manual for Microsoft. It's a perspective chart. Windows can live over here, but everything can live out of it. The fact of the matter was that I gave them the chart and the Windows logo. They already had the type, and that was the end of my stay. I did it for 6 months, and all of the logos came after I left. And they were done by in-house art departments or by people who might be working against the chart, but it was really kind of miraculous because they were measuring this thing based on a principle. And when I look at Windows in relationship to where this thing started, it's not really so terribly different. And making it flat in 2012 was sacrosanct. There was about a week where I was afraid to go out of my house when I redesigned that logo. I mean, people were just screaming about it. I got rid of the colors, I got rid of the gradations, how could I do that? But then, only a year later, Apple started flattening things out, and then Google flattened everything out, and that's the way it goes. And sometimes you know more than the public does because you've been working with it and you've been thinking about it longer. So imagine what happens as things are launched and the sort of brouhaha about them. You sort of have to step back and just give it a little more thought. This was another one of my favorite projects, actually, of this past decade. And the project really, like Windows, had a lot of pushback. I mean, people really hated it. And I love it in all its glory, and I'm going to sort of take you through what happened. The New School is a school that you may not have heard of in New York City. It was originally the New School for Social Research. It is a progressive school. It has an incredible history. It was, I think, founded in 1919. And in 1972, it bought a school you have heard of called Parsons School of Design. And Parsons School of Design has more students than all of the New School together. These are all the logos they've had over the years that we could find. And as you can see, it's a real dog's dinner of things. They seem to moved around in a lot of different directions. We did a study to find out what various schools looked like and why they looked that way. And the best we could determine was that if you were trying to be an Ivy League school, you had serif typography. And if you weren't, you had sans serif typography. That's it, folks. No other point of view there. We agreed it was going to be a sans serif school, and also it went well with the modernist history of the school. The New School had this beautiful square type, which I originally used in one of the identity signs in this Joseph Urban building that was, I think, built in 1927 on 13th Street, where it still stands. It's really a landmark beauty and should never be touched, and very much reflected the spirit of the school. If you notice on the top, there are a series of bars that run across the building, and that the bars would be something that I would pick up on for connecting the schools together. Now, the New School was about to reorganize all its programs and make it so that students at Parsons could be capable of attending anything that related to the art or design practice they were in. For example, if you were an editorial designer, you might take a journalism course. Or if you were going to go into branding, you would go into the anthropology program. Things like that, which put it at a tremendous advantage because they had it all there. And the school is a campus on Fifth Avenue. It's an area that's very connected and a very successful urban school that has most of its buildings right next to each other. There was another building that went up on Fifth Avenue that was a new student dorm and facilities area that had a big auditorium and some labs, and it also had the same kind of stripe structure that the Joseph Urban building did. This building was built by Skidmore, Owens, Merrill. And I decided that the stripes were a good thing to use because it represented both forms of architecture. Not in the Joseph Urban building, in the new building, there was a font that was designed by a Dutch type designer I love named Peter Bielak. And he had designed these fonts for the New School so that every different school would be represented by a different kind of typeface. The problem was that in directories together, you couldn't read anything. It was just too complicated. So I thought maybe the obvious thing to do would be to pick this thing up, fill it in, use the two bars to set up a logo for the New School, let the New School work in a couple of configurations for all spaces, and I sort of thought this was a nice situation where I had paid attention to the history of the school and actually used things that already existed instead of being an egomaniac and completely reinventing them. And I thought that then these bars could extend and different areas of the school could be highlighted. And I thought that was kind of a nice system. And I presented it to my clients, who were 40 people in a room at a time, I don't exaggerate, the head of every single school. And they said, too boring. They wanted the school to be a breakthrough school, and it wasn't. So I went, okay, what if I do that? And they said, more. So then I did that. I didn't know what I was doing. We were just sort of elongating letter forms because it made the type more eccentric looking and not so restricted, and it seemed to represent the spirit of the school a bit. I really wasn't quite sure what was going on there. And then I went back and showed them the logo with the new typography for the names, and they said, well, the O's are too round in the school. So I took them back. They said they were too wide. So they went back. Not all the way, just a little bit. And then I looked at this thing and I had a complete nightmare on my hand because I had 3 O's. And those were sort of the widths of the letter forms. And I kept staring at this thing, deciding if it was incredibly stupid and ugly or if it was something that could be extended into a really strong visual language. And I realized that it was the perfect time to do this because you could, in fact, program types of different weights to work together, and that it could create a whole new font that would be unexpected, which we named Noya. So the new school, and you'll notice the eccentric W, was built out of the 3 weights. And the W is the most eccentric letter form because of the nature of the way type has to be redrawn when it's expanded. But with all of these different schools and components, you began recognizing them as one thing, and it had this kind of crazy modern look to it. When you put it together, and this was exceedingly important, you could look at the list of the courses that would be offered, and then within 3 years, all the courses and all the schools changed names because they were reorganizing it. And it happened very seamlessly because people were too busy looking at the overall look and not actually reading, which was great for the school. So here are the letter forms, and you see the 3 weights. And it created a whole new spirit of typography when you put them together. And it became highly recognizable, unlike that other font I showed you called Irma, which is actually very classical and not at all eccentric. This is Peter Bielak's drawing of it, and you'll look at the W, and you'll see that the reason he had to make the W flat on the bottom is that when you take something and you change the width of it, it creates hot spots in the typography that would have shown up. And he gave me a whole lecture on why that was there, and I said, all right, let's go with that W. Everybody hated the W. They called it the Neb School. They thought it looked like 2 V's. It was very embarrassing. You see the issue. But I kind of love it, and I thought, all right, let's stick it there, go all the way for it, and people will get used to it. And the 40 people who had approval really actually agreed to that. They liked the eccentricity of it because they felt it really expressed the spirit of the school, which is a feisty place. And that as we began developing the other weights, we have a lighter weight still. They draw a new weight each year, and Peter Bielak still does it. And it has one of the best in-house art departments in New York City. And the work is just spectacular. It's better than when we first launched it and makes me exceedingly happy. But look at all the different ways you can say one word, how many different configurations and widths there are, so that you put information together differently each time. And then we started making things. And the thing that was terrific about that is that you could recognize this thing without a logo. That means that everything they do, everything they say becomes a logo, because you read the type. Here, if you look in the corner where it says the new school and you see the color differential, it's because they're having their 100th anniversary, and that was the way they treated the logo, and they did that in-house without my involvement, and I love it. I think it's just great. The website's been redone since we first did it, and it's terrific. These things are still pretty much the same. And the buildings and the campus is very strong. This is on 14th Street. Students did this with me. We brought the students in to do a lot of the work as we were rolling it out at Parsons. And this was just finished about a month and a half ago. This is an elevator cage that we painted and strung signage on. It's a donor signage for this school that sits on top, all built out of metal. And the metal goes around the corner of the cages. But that thing really extended and still remains one of my favorite projects. When it launched and everybody hated it, and I had about a week of terrible press and people thought I got paid $3 million and stuff like that. I mean, you know, it was a school. What do you think you got paid? Nothing. So anyway, when that happened, I was really devastated because it's an art school and I wanted the students to feel ownership over it, and they just hated it. And I was forced to answer mean tweets at Parsons, which was just humiliating. And then a year later, it all went away, and I didn't know why it went away so fast. And I realized what happened was the students graduated. I wasn't designing for them, I was designing for the next year. I just didn't know it. And that says a lot to me about identity design, that those who are there and have ownership over it will resist, and the next group will not have the same problem about it. And it's true in companies, it's true really in almost anything you design. If the expectation is there that it has to be something, you're kind of dead. This was a project that was both identity and packaging and advertising. And it came from Korea. It's a Korean company, and they asked us to what they called correct their logo, which really meant fix the spacing of their Helvetica, and to find a way that they could use it to promote their product and to redesign their packaging. Their packaging is a whole thing in itself, and I don't want to show you that. I designed it with a man named Peter Vrankovich, and it's quite terrific. It had some very simple elements. It was just really simple Helvetica on some beautifully designed packaging that had a great shape. And the top of the packaging has a plus sign that is indicative of the kind of product inside it, that we created as a promotional system and as something they could extrapolate from their otherwise bland identity to really say something. So there are a series of about 40 different plus signs that are made out of different designs that all mean something and that are related to specific products. Here are some of them together. This is something called ceramidum. It restores moisture to the innermost layers of your skin. This one evens skin tone and restores skin strength. This one minimizes pores. This one targets acne. This is a cleansing system. That's the first one I showed you. This is a basic step-by-step system for men. Anti-aging, I can't quite get that in this one. Increases collagen production, that I get. Provides moisture for sensitive skin. By the way, this stuff isn't bad. I've used it. I didn't break out. It was good. 7 vitamins for skin removal. Well, we only had 4 places. That one didn't work so well. And then it became the way they can promote themselves and package themselves and show themselves in the store, and this thing really worked as a promotional system. The thing is that the packaging itself is more iconic here than the graphics. And I find that when I'm doing packaging design, I usually let the package drive the graphics because it's always phenomenally recognizable when it's 3D and if it's not graphically based. So it's sort of an interesting thing to work on, but the pluses helped us out, just took us a little bit farther. This is a completely 3D project, and I look at my 3D work as identity work also. And it's the same approach as what I took to the Type Directors Club, which was really finding one dumb thing and finding a pile of different ways to do it so that you always recognize where you are and what the place is. And it may be the most branded cinema ever if you ever need that. I'm not quite sure that you do, but I like the project. Not terribly original. It's it's the quad cinema. The type is made out of squares. It makes sense. The building sits on 13th Street, just right down the block from Parsons, by the way. And it's a little jewel box of a theater that has 4 cinemas in there. They used to have fantastic art films in the 70s and the 80s. And if you wanted to pretend like you were an intellectual, it was a great place to go on a date back in the day. I still go there. They have great movies. They do a lot of foreign movies, and they have a lot of movies by independent directors. It's owned by a man named Charles Cohen, who also owns the Pacific Design Center in LA. He's a movie buff, and he has a company called Cohen Media, and they bought the Quad. So everything is, straight graphic design based on the square typography. We made square tickets. That was unusual. But what was really wonderful was that the typography could become part of the building. And on 13th Street, the awning extends out into the street like 4 air conditioning ducts. And it shoots through the building and turns itself backwards so it creates the words on the other side. This is the front, and that's the inside. And it sort of slips up and down there. And then, of course, it's used near the ticketing windows. And this Jumbotron that we made out of a series of screens that are really one screen, but it's a mat over the screens that creates the rounded cube shape. And these are programmed so that they play a number of movies in different configurations, and they change form based on the movie. If it's a silent movie, it gets one kind of treatment. If it's a full color movie, it gets another. And these things sequence. They have about a 20-minute cycle, and then they change out the movies sometimes, and they all become a different thing. We loved doing this. It was great because we had total control here. This is the entry to the cinemas, and there are 4 theaters, and the theaters are the Q, the U, the A, and the D. So this sort of directs you to them. And these are the inside of the theaters. That's the Q, the U, the A, and the D. Don't you love when that happens? What if it had another letter in there? I'd never be able to do that theater. Expedia Group, which we did last year, and Jeremy Mickle is going to be speaking here, so he'll show this work he did for me, and we've done a lot of work together, and he's wonderful to work with, what I'd like to do is find a hook within a letter form that can be established into a typeface. And I usually start by working with traditional letter forms and doing something bizarre with it, like we did with Parsons, and then you find the way to draw the whole thing. And what the Expedia Group is it was called Expedia Inc. It oversees 1 million companies like Hotels.com and Expedia and 1 million travel agencies. And it also has a large department of different functioning businesses within it that people don't know. And this is what they look like. They're really what my old partner would have called a dog's dinner. Just sort of this mess of stuff that doesn't, sometimes they have a logo next to it, sometimes they have that sort of cloud-like E, sometimes they just have the word Expedia there, but it was a mess. So mostly we saw this as a graphic cleanup, and we thought what they need is a mark they can live with and then a name that would make them recognizable. So we gave them this typeface that had this eccentric E, and that became the logo for Expedia Group. This is the E by itself, and this is their mark. And they can use their mark on anything, or they can just use the type. This is the alphabet. And the alphabet is bizarre because if you look at the A's and the B's, the thinness matches the sort of thinness on the lowercase e. So the lowercase e looks like it belongs. But the lowercase e was drawn first before the alphabet. And that was the mark. And then it goes to, that's when I worked with Jeremy to get it to work back and forth until it made a great font. So here's how it works as sub-brand headings in that system. Corporate stuff. As an app, always got to do the app. And as promotion, and that this is another one of these things that you can actually recognize without the logo. The logo is there, the E is a signifier, but the fact of the matter is that the font becomes eccentric in this way that once you make the connection, you never have to use the logo by itself. This is one where we just had fun. We were doing a restaurant in, it opened in Chicago. It was originally in New Orleans, and they're going to be a chain of them. And it's a restaurant that's a food hall where there are lots of little divisions where they sell different kinds of food, and they wanted a lot of sub-branding. And it was the kind of project I took on because they only had 3 weeks to do it. I like that. That means I'm done fast. And that the fact of the matter was that they didn't have a lot of money, so they had to do what I say, which my favorite way of working. So we gave them a series of Ps that, by virtue of the style of the typography and the period in which the type was drawn, you recognize it even if the weight and scale changes as one thing, which is amazing. Because actually, individually, the heights are different, the widths are different, the treatments of them are different, but yet in the organization of them, they function like the same thing. It really was right out of an 1880s wood type book. If you took a look at the way fonts were drawn and how many different configurations they had, and how wide they could be. That if you look at these 3 levels of things, and when you veer too far, or you add a curve, or even if you start to do things like doing too extensive a drop shadow, like the Type Directors Club, it doesn't work. But the play is the fun part. And I love doing this sort of work because I learn from it. So I learn how much something can handle, and it's good for the client as well. They were really ecstatic with this. I have to say, they were great clients. It was a very happy 3 weeks. And we made everything for the place, and there's the crapola. Can't leave that out. And there you go. The last project I'm going to show you I've been working on for 25 years, actually 26 this year. I wrote a book about it. It'll be out in March. And it's really my understanding, more than anything else, of how identity works. And that the public theater, for me, is my lab because I actually have been able to be involved with it long enough to know what works and what doesn't. And I've been able to export what I've learned to other projects that I work on. It started with my affinity for wood type, not unlike Politan, but this is 1994, before any of this stuff was computerized. And the public theater logo type, designed in that period, was going from a source of wood typography that existed long before all of you were born, and that came in a series of different weights. Now, we redrew the letter forms on a few of these because there weren't 5 competing weights, but I found something that had the width of the P and ended with a C, and the rest were sort of filled in related to other things that worked, and that this became the logo of the theater, and that it also became the basis of its communication system, in that the theater would be represented in this wood typography that would give you the list of programs and shows and things that were going on in a communicative way that wasn't like theater advertising, like didn't have cute slogans. It would just give you the time and place, who was in the cast, and just the facts. Then it would be represented by these individualistic posters for different plays. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these, they've been around. But the fact of the matter is, other than graphic designers or the people who went to that little theater, nobody saw these. They weren't out on the street. there was never any money to really promote with them. There were black and white newspaper ads, but the general public didn't see it. They got into a lot of graphic design annuals, and so graphic designers saw them. Then they started being collected by people who collect graphic design. But I can't say they really functioned as promoting a play, ever. The one thing that everybody did see were these Shakespeare in the Park posters that are in New York City in the summers, and they buy subway space and train station space, and these are pretty ubiquitous, but they only go on once a year. So I don't know how many people really recognize them either. I liked what they looked like, and I liked working for the theater, and then this crazy thing happened. They put on a show called Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk. And I did a poster that looked like this. And there were actually many posters like this that we did. We did about, I think, a campaign from 1996 through 2000 where the type changed subtly, but it essentially had to look like this, and something terrible happened. What happened was, first of all, it was displayed in New York because it was on Broadway, and people didn't connect it to the public theater. And secondly, people started imitating it, and it became a popular style. It's a terrible thing when your identity becomes a popular style, because it means they don't recognize you, you're just one of them. That was a bad thing to happen to a theater where I was in charge, so I had to figure out what to do. So I started changing it, and I started doing these kind of posters. Oh, these are more of the noise funk posters, just so you can see, but they're connected. They're the same thing. There were a million things like this in New York in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then, of course, it was already dated. So I changed them to something that looked like this. And I remember I brought them into the director of the theater, a man named George Wolfe, and he looked at them, and at that point in time, I was turning 50. And he said, "Oh, Paula's turning 50. Let's have a year of depressing posters." But I wanted them not to look like anything else. Then I started doing anything I could. Then the type got bigger again, but it wasn't the wood type. I would change it each year. Then I'd do any damn thing I felt like. You know, I mean, I just went over. Then this director left, and another director, Oscar Eustis, who's still there, came in, and I really thought he was going to fire me. But he didn't. He asked me to just readdress it again. And I did, and we did some posters that were different, but not really strong enough on their own, not my favorite period. And then I thought, what am I doing wrong? Why aren't they recognizable? Why don't ordinary people know what the public theater looks like? At this point in time, I'd been designing for it for about 15 years, and I felt like I'd made no impact because first you didn't see them, then they were knocked off, so everybody saw them, so they didn't look like the public, and then there were these one-offs. There was never any money to produce enough of it. And it dawned on me that I could take a season of the summer, which everyone did see, and turn it into a system by which every play, every program, everything at Joe's Pub and the Cabaret could be designed against. So the first season we did this poster for the summer that was for Love's Labour Lost and Comedy of Errors, which was a backwards-facing thing, and we decided how we would make it work for a season. We also did the signs in the park for it, using that as a basic of the graphic, where the poster itself essentially became the identity for the public for 1 year. So this was purely for the park. After we completed the park, the Shakespeare in the Park stuff, we thought, well, how do we make a season? And we decided that we'd make a manual out of it and pick up elements about the poster and translate it and flop the emphasis of the color. So we began creating posters like this. At this period in time, I'd sent one of my students down to the public, and she had risen from being an intern to sort of the major art person there controlling it, and she hired more people so they could do this really in-house. And what happened was this ability to create complete seasons. We did it the next year with this poster that was skewed. Now, here's what's interesting. If you look at the black and yellow poster, you'll notice a lot of names of plays, and right there is a name of a play that you probably heard of called Hamilton. We didn't do the Broadway poster for Hamilton this time because based on what happened with Bringing the Noise, Bringing the Funk, we thought we'll make the money from Hamilton at the theater, but the theater that produces it on Broadway gets to own it after it leaves the public. So when it launched at the public, it got phenomenal press. There was a huge contract with the Broadway theater, and the public theater gets a couple $1 million a year from the shows or some such thing that promotes the theater, and we just let it go so that this thing maintains its individuality and there aren't, as a season, but not letting shows stand out one out after another. We've been doing this now for, I think, 6 years, and it's been incredibly successful. The reason it's been incredibly successful is because people seem to know what the public theater looks like. But what happened, which I hadn't expected, was that the membership went up. As a matter of fact, it went way up. And it went way up partially because of what they were producing, but partially because of the connectivity of it all. That instead of making these individual sub-brands that were these posters that were one-offs, that you saw this thing as part of a whole, and that mattered. Each year it changes, so now people look, and if you saw Abstract, this is what I was working on 2 years ago, people look at this thing as one season, and they want to go for the whole season because it all looks exciting. It isn't like they're choosing one show over another, which is also the danger of these not-for-profit places. We started animating them just 2 years ago because we could, because there was a place to show them in New York City, and now they're in the backs of taxi cabs and in the subways in certain spots. But it's been fantastic to do it, but what's even better, and this is this season, is that the public participates, that we only have to do a limited amount of advertising, really, to show what these things look like in the real world, because after we do them, people show them on Instagram, and you get a double bump. And that's it, and I'll take some questions. And I love questions, so please ask them. Don't be shy. I know it looks like there are a lot of people here, but yeah.
Sir, there's microphones in the aisles for the Q&A.
Okay, there's microphones in the aisles for the Q&A.
I started as a freelance identity designer for a company that now employs me full-time.
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
No, I didn't hear you. You sounded garbled.
Okay, sorry. Is that better?
Yes,
slower?
Enunciate.
Good. I designed an identity for a company about 10 or 12 years ago as a contractor. I'm now employed by that company. We like the adage, never look back. But I'm curious about your thoughts about when you know when it's time to update an identity. What are the signs or the indications that you should refresh? I personally have feelings about that, about my work 10 or 12 years ago that I'd like to update. So I just want your thoughts on that.
But you work there?
So I was hired about 4 months ago to join the company that I was contracting with about 12 years ago.
And do you think it looks fusty?
Yeah, it's dated, definitely.
Do you know how to fix it?
I have some ideas.
Do you have a connection to somebody you can talk to about it in the company who has power?
I actually have a really good relationship with the president of the company.
Talk to him. Tell him. Say, hey, this looks fusty. What do you think? Can I show you some things?
Cool.
That's all you do.
Hi.
Oh, good. I can't see. Oh, there you are.
When you redesigned the Parsons font with multiple weights of letters, how did you write with it? Like, how did you know which weight to use?
It's an algorithm, but it's not based on anything. In other words, that you don't. There are a couple of glyphs. Like you're never allowed to make two like different size O's next to each other, or any kind of rounds next to each other at different sizes, so that it'll automatically correct that. But the rest of it is accident. When I showed you that page that said flexible, I was amazed at how many variables there were that you could create with that font. And other people have been doing it. I've been seeing a lot of fonts like that lately. because they have, if the font itself is beautifully drawn, they develop an interesting rhythm. I'm amazed at it, by the way. I didn't know it was going to work that well. That was half accidental from the meetings.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have kind of a follow-up to that. To me, the new school type is so part of New York now, at least in my experience. And it was a product to some degree of clients just saying this is boring.
Right.
So how do you know when to listen to that and when to not listen to that?
Well, I didn't want to argue with 40 people. I mean, there's like, if there's 3 people in a room, I have a shot, but if 40 people were yelling out, no, that's too boring, we don't want to be boring, that looks like Helvetica, why did you do that? You don't do that. They were right. They were right. I thought because there were 40 of them, I better be, sort of manage the process and be very careful about what I would do. But what was wonderful was when I got all that criticism, they really stood by it. Because it was intense for a period of time, and that's the kind of thing a school would be very nervous about. But I had 40 sign-offs, and they're happy now. It's great.
Yep.
But these things, really the point I want to make is that identity is for the long haul. It's not the immediate reaction. It's the long haul.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, Paula. Thank you for being here so early.
I'm from New York. It's not that early.
Okay. I showed your TED Talk in one of my classes, and it was very meaningful for a few of the students who really want to be perfect the first time. My question to you is that when you're having meetings with 40 decision makers and nerdy graphic designers like us are collecting your crap on bags, how do you keep your work from being solemn, and how do you stay serious? That's more of an update. I'm tracking you like a stalker, but currently, I mean, I don't know if you're painting maps anymore, but how do you do it?
Well, I really like making things. That's what I never had any doubt about what I wanted to do. And it's important for me to feel like I'm growing. And I want to try new things. I mean, the thing I was showing you about the Type Directors Club was it's a very significant part of the way I work, which is to find something that I experiment with to see what's possible to then bring into a commercial project. And that, for me, that's exciting. Now, I have to reinvent again because I've been doing that since 2012, so, that's a little grim. But I find that I have really 3 lives, that I balance my graphic design with 3-dimensional design. I do a lot of environments, and I also do the painting. And right now, I would say in the past 2 years, the graphics have taken over because I've had some very scalable projects that have eaten up my time. But I think I'm about to move back into a painting phase. I move back and forth. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, Paula.
Hi.
Great to see you again on stage. Last time I saw you was in Berlin at Beyond Teledan 2 years ago. So it's so great to see you again. Thank you for being here this early. I have a question, actually 2 questions. The first question is, have you obviously you worked in a lot of English context. Have you worked in any other languages apart from English? If so, is there any fun story to share?
I'm working on a job with an Israeli company right now, and I had some type drawn for them that I think was completely wrong. I think like they couldn't read it. I mean, I didn't know what I'd done wrong. They were sort of very angry at me because apparently we'd really completely messed up the letter forms. But a lot of the work is translatable. I do a lot of projects that translate into a lot of languages. So. Depending upon who's working with me, it's a problem or not a problem. I just need to be informed properly.
So you work with a lot of local people?
I'll get, if it's typography and it has to be drawn in a different font, I'll hire the appropriate people, and they're supposed to know what they're doing. And they tell me that it's right and it works. In the particular Israeli instance, it didn't. But generally it does, and I'll hire whatever consultant I need to do the job appropriately. but I certainly can't read it.
Gotcha.
And so that's problematic.
It's always good to work with other people.
That's
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Can I ask a question over here?
Sure.
So when you approach a
Where are you?
organization about, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Like the Philadelphia Museum of Art, if the identity already in the city was the art museum, did you propose a new name, like
We
the
did.
Philadelphia Art Museum?
No, we wanted to call it Art Museum Philadelphia. But the trustees wouldn't allow it. They just it was too big a deal. There are charters, there's all kinds of stuff that exists within a city
Right.
with something that's existed there that long.
Right.
So, and there was always an inside-outside problem with that museum in that Philadelphians don't use it anywhere nearly the amount that New Yorkers use the Met.
Right.
So it's really sad in a way. And I think some of it is its location up on the hill, because it does seem off-putting. And so the whole, I've been working with them now for 6 years. I still consult for them. And I didn't show parts of the interventions we did where we put up things in the street so it would engage people so they would go up into the museum. It's rough. That location is a rough thing for the museum, though their attendance has really gone up.
Okay, so in other projects, do you have any success rate getting them to change their name?
Oh, yeah. And sometimes I just name things. I mean, it isn't that you don't have a success rate. The problem is that it depends upon what name you're changing. If you're changing something that's been in a city for 1 million years and there's a serious board of trustees that just aren't going to allow you to do that, you can't do that. You can do it with a startup company. You can do it with somebody where you just shorten the name by virtue of the way you design it. Like we lopped Lincoln Center off Jazz. That's a name change. The Public Theater is now called the Public because I got sick of setting theater and type and said, let's just get rid of that. Nobody cares anyway. You know, I mean, there's stuff that you can do because you are using the public vernacular, and that's what should have happened to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but it just couldn't happen.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Okay. This side.
Hi.
Hi.
How do you deal with, or do you get upset that everyone's copying you all the time?
Well, not all the time. No, the public theater thing was unnerving because I never had that before. I never designed anything that was specific for someone where it became a popular style of graphics. And that was unnerving because it meant that this little theater lost its identity to popular culture. Now, if I had designed the identity and that was a popular style and I'd put it into the theater, that would be my responsibility, but it happened the other way. And it was unnerving, but I don't really care if somebody copies. I just care if everybody in New York City is doing it at the time I'm promoting a theater. That was scary. It was really not, it never happened before. It hasn't happened since.
Because I can imagine, even what you have on the board right now, people pinning things on Pinterest and then making posters that look very much like that.
Yeah, but that doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
It just really doesn't. I think that people's originality always shines through in the best things you see made, and that the second and third versions are forgotten, really. I wouldn't worry about it too much.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Okay, which microphone? Okay, this guy.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were looking at him.
No, I'm
so
looking at you.
my question is, and thank you for being here, by the way, Paula. What is the first thing you do after you get a brief? What does your creative process look like? And I know that's a loaded question, but.
Well, I really don't do well with briefs because I don't like reading them. They're boring. Generally, what I want to do is have enough questions to ask the client face-to-face or on the phone. Mostly face-to-face when I can do it, if not WebEx, where I really get a sense of not what the brief says, but where they're coming from in writing the brief. What made them do this thing in the first place? Why are they changing? Why are they getting a new identity? Is a new president? That's usually one reason. Another reason is they're about to go out of business. I mean, you kind of want to know what the story and the lay of the land is before you even jump into the thing. And then I ask a lot of different questions, and generally what they like and what they think they like. What milieu do they live in? Who are their customers? What are their customers like? That sort of thing.
Awesome. Thank you.
But face to face, it's better. Yep.
All right, we gotta wrap it up.
Oh, good. How many more up there?
We can do one more.
Okay, we can do one more.
Hi. Just over here. So I noticed that you have a very interesting kind of skill for finding those niches in your client's identity, and you've kind of already touched on it, but I was wondering like how you create that dialogue, like you're talking about face-to-face and kind of getting to know your client as opposed to the brief. Like, do you have any typical questions you ask, or is it more so just like a conversation, I guess?
I have some typical questions that usually goes into a fairly individualistic conversation. They're pretty much the things I just told you. It's really the circumstances that got them there. Is more, and where do they want to go? But where do they want to go? Everybody wants it. They want to be more successful. You know, they want more customers. They want to break through some area that they're not covering. But when you find out why they're in that position, they've really already told you the answer about what you need to do. So, and then the other thing I like to do, though others are different, is I don't hire a strategist. I go in by myself. I don't like a lot of assistants. I usually go in with my project coordinator, Rusty, and we try to make the thing really intimate and not complicated. Even if it's a bigger group, I keep it very small.
Absolutely. I think that dialogue is like the most important part. So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, guys.